Okay, the last thing that we're going to talk about in this lecture part of the module 5 is the section here on Indigenous separation of powers, Indigenous governance part 2. One of the things that we saw in the Western system is a separation of powers that's based in dividing, I guess you say, the functions of lawmaking and law enforcing and law administering. And that seems to be the focus of Aristotle's separation of powers. And of course, within that is the assumption then that human beings are those who make the law. Well, the basic assumption within most tribal communities and indigenous separations of power is that law comes from the Creator, not from man. And so there wasn't a whole lot of need to make law as such, that there was this basic sense of natural law. We've talked a little bit about natural law here a couple of weeks ago, but we're looking at this idea of natural law and something like Ubuntu, which is like the law that you recognize my humanity and you treat me well because you're a human and I am a human. And so we start off with this basic assumption that law comes from the Creator, not from man. And therefore, what we find very much like participation in government, the separation of powers is built into the structure of society. It's not based in the structure of laws, but it's based in the structure of society. And then there also, the other part of it is that checks and balances are in place within the societal structure to keep a person or a group of people from accumulating an inordinate amount of power. Now, that's the basic assumption, and quite honestly, the checks and balances assumptions for Aristotle is the same, is to keep a particular person or a group of persons from accumulating inordinate amounts of power. So what we see in indigenous communities in terms of separation of powers is on at least 4 different levels. The first level of separation of powers is what we would call gender-based, and we talked about that a little while ago in the other in part 1 when we talked about the Algonquin women and the Iroquois Confederacy, where the clan mothers are the ones who decide which males will represent the clan or the tribe in council. And if these men fail to follow what the women have told them is important to follow, or if it turns out that they're making decisions based on their own personal desires, um, then their authority is taken away from them. As they say in the Iroquois Confederacy, the horns are taken from them. This is also this gender-based separation of powers is also reinforced by the fact that most of these are matrilineal societies, and the women own the property, not the men. And so the men can't be using their position to strengthen their positions of having more and more property. They find themselves making decisions on their own self-interest. They lose their position, and they're not because they don't own the property, they're not in a position to retaliate. The second basis of separation of powers is war and peace. And that means then that there are peace chiefs and there are war chiefs. There are people who, because of their demeanor, are identified as people who will lead and during times of peace, and their role is to ensure that um, what happens in the community is based in these ideas of reconciliation if there's any kinds of disagreements, and reparations if there's any kind of damages. And so they're basically the chiefs end up applying the law, the law of the natural law to things that happens in the community. On the other hand, in times of war, the war chiefs take over. And the war chiefs have absolute power because during times of war you don't need people sitting down and endlessly discussing what needs to be done. And you don't have people becoming dissidents and doing things contrary to what the peace chief, what the war chief says, because the war chiefs are in charge of maintaining the safety and integrity of the community. So even today, we have peace chiefs and war chiefs in a lot of tribal communities. Most of the pueblos have a war chief or a war captain. In some Pueblo communities, there's people still designated as peace chiefs, and this is true in quite a number of other tribes as well. The other basis for separation of powers is in the clans, and that is if not all tribes are clan tribes, not every tribe has clans, but a lot of those tribes that do have clans, there are limitations that if you don't belong to a certain clan, you will not have a certain you will only have certain kinds of authority. So the best example of that is that leadership in the Algonquin tribes around the Great Lakes, Upper Midwest, their leaders all came from the Crane clan. And if you weren't a Crane clan, then the chances of a political authority is pretty slim, simply because of the fact that the Cranes, because of their role in the way that the world works, of being able to fly above the trees and seeing where things are and leading their people, leading the Crane people as they make their migrations. They they began to symbolize those people who have the powers of leadership, and so you have to be born into a Crane clan to be in a position of leadership. And of course, that's under the old laws. It's not under the new laws that we have today. And then the last form of separation of powers is based in these various tribal societies that fulfill certain governmental functions. Some tribal societies were like the internal police, who basically kept order during within the tribe. And then there were those societies that basically fought to protect the tribe from outside influences. And then there was other kinds of societies throughout the whole tribe, and these societies were integrated and very structurally organized so that they served a lot of the governmental functions. So we didn't really have a sense of a separate government that you go down and talk to the mayor's office or something like that. It was very much a part of how society was developed. And what we have today is a pretty large departure from that. But at the same time, we also have to look at um, these differences between the West and tribal government came in such a way that the tribal governments were never able to take these concepts of indigenous participation in government, indigenous separation of powers, this idea of confederacy, and use that in a way to uh, evolve our governments in concert with the way that the West was moving. And we ended up having a lot of governments imposed in our tribal communities, and a lot of changes and a lot of problems that resulted from that.